When we think about the period between the two world wars, it's easy to picture it as a kind of intermission, right? A time of peace. But what if it wasn't peace at all? What if it was really just a 20-year countdown, a long chain of dominoes, each one tipping over the next, leading straight to an even bigger disaster? To really get how that happened, we've got to trace the path from the end of one war to the start of the next. So on November 11th, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. People called it the war to end all wars. And yet, just over 2 decades later, on September 1st, 1939, German tanks are rolling into Poland, and the world is on fire again. The big question is, how? How did the promise of a lasting peace lead directly to a conflict that was even more brutal?
Well, to find the answer, you have to go right back to the beginning. The very first domino to fall was the Treaty of Versailles. This wasn't just a document to end a war. It was, in many ways, the blueprint for the next one. It was a peace, as they say, built on sand.
Let's be clear, this treaty wasn't a foundation for peace, it was basically a minefield. For starters, German generals started spreading this myth that they weren't actually defeated, but were betrayed, stabbed in the back by their own politicians. Meanwhile, new countries like Czechoslovakia were created, which left millions of ethnic Germans living outside of Germany. And to top it all off, the United States, whose own president came up with the idea for the League of Nations, refused to join it. That fatally weakened the whole thing from the get-go. And then there was the bill. Germany was ordered to pay £6.6 billion in reparations. I mean, for a country that was already completely shattered by war, this wasn't just a fee. It was a punishment designed to absolutely cripple them. It was an economic time bomb just sitting there waiting to go off.
And that economic time bomb? Well, it absolutely went off. All that instability and hardship created the perfect breeding ground for extremism. You see, when people are desperate, they start looking for desperate answers. And that's exactly when dictators tend to step out of the shadows.
Germany got hit with this brutal 1-2 punch. First, in the 1920s, hyperinflation got so insane that people's entire life savings became literally worthless overnight. Then, just as they were starting to get back on their feet, the 1929 stock market crash in America kicks off the Great Depression. By the early 30s, 6 million Germans had no job. Society was just falling apart, and the democratic government looked totally helpless.
And into this chaos steps Adolf Hitler. Now, he'd already tried to seize power with an armed coup in 1923, and it landed him in jail. So he changed his strategy. He decided to use the very democratic system he hated to destroy it from the inside. He preyed on all that economic misery, and his Nazi party grew and grew. By 1933, he was named chancellor. And then, less than a year later, the president died, and Hitler just merged the two jobs, making himself the absolute leader, the Führer.
So, with a rearming, aggressive Germany now on the scene, the world's so-called security system, the League of Nations, was about to be put to the test. And spoiler alert, it was going to fail, spectacularly. The first big test came in 1931. Japan, which was a leading member of the League, just straight up invaded Manchuria, which was part of China, another member. This was a flagrant act of aggression, the exact kind of thing the League was created to prevent. So, what did the world do? You guessed it, absolutely nothing. The League issued a condemnation, but it had no army, no real power. So Japan just shrugged and walked out. A really dangerous precedent had just been set. If you're a powerful country, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And that precedent got tested again just 4 years later by Mussolini's Italy. He decided to invade Abyssinia, what we now call Ethiopia, using tanks, warplanes, and even illegal chemical weapons against an army that was mostly armed with spears. The Ethiopian emperor went to the League himself and begged for help. And again, crickets. They put some weak economic sanctions on Italy that didn't really do anything. The message to any aggressor out there was now crystal clear. The major powers, Britain and France, they just didn't have the stomach for a fight. The League of Nations was a paper tiger. Then came the Spanish Civil War, which was basically a dress rehearsal for World War II. Germany and Italy sent troops and weapons to help the fascist General Franco, using Spain as a live fire testing ground for their new planes and tactics. And what did Britain and France do? They adopted a policy of non-intervention. So the fascists won, and Hitler learned another valuable lesson. The democracies would not get in his way. Okay, so Hitler's been watching all this.
He's seen the world do nothing time and time again. He's emboldened. He decides it's time to make his big play, to start a high-stakes campaign to reclaim German lands and build his new empire. And the pace is just terrifying. In 1936, he marches troops into the Rhineland, which was supposed to be a demilitarized zone. Total violation of the treaty. Nobody stops him. In March of 1938, he annexes Austria. Again, nothing. By September, he's demanding a huge piece of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Every move was a bigger gamble, and every single time, the world just folded. This leads to the infamous policy we now call appeasement. The leaders of Britain and France, absolutely desperate to avoid another war, fly to Munich to meet with Hitler. And there, they make a deal. They agreed to give him the Sudetenland, basically sacrificing a piece of Czechoslovakia in exchange for his solemn promise that this was his last territorial demand. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew home waving that piece of paper and famously told the crowds that he had secured peace for our time. I mean, you can imagine the relief people felt across Europe, but it was all based on a tragic, complete misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. Because just 6 months later, that promise was shattered. German troops marched in and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was a huge turning point, because for the first time, Hitler was conquering non-German people. The policy of appeasement wasn't just a failure, it was a catastrophe. And the last few dominoes were starting to teeter. The fall of Czechoslovakia finally convinced Britain and France that Hitler couldn't be trusted and had to be stopped. They issued a guarantee to protect Poland's independence. But Hitler, well, he had one last shocking diplomatic ace to play that would clear his path to war. In August of 1939, news broke that just stunned the world. Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union, two regimes that were supposed to be mortal enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it just meant they wouldn't attack each other, but secretly, they had agreed to slice Poland up between them. This cynical deal meant Hitler didn't have to worry about fighting a war on two fronts. The very last obstacle was now gone. Just 1 week later, on September 1st, 1939, the German army poured across the Polish border. This was it. This was the final move. Britain and France honored their promise and declared war on Germany. The 20-year countdown was over. The Second World War had begun. So when you look back, you can see the chains so clearly. It starts with a flawed peace that just guaranteed resentment. That instability gets supercharged by economic collapse, which allows extremists to take over. The world's inaction in the face of early aggression just encourages them to do more. Then, the desperate attempt at appeasement proves that giving in is seen as weakness. And finally, that shocking pact between enemies gives the green light for the invasion that started it all. It really does seem like an inevitable 20-year march from one global conflict to the next. And that leaves us with this one big, lingering question. At what point could one of those dominoes have been stopped? Could history have fallen any differently? Something to think about.